Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Rudomin, and we are continuing with our series on the book of Genesis. Today, we'll be reading, studying, delving into Genesis chapter 19. And if you have a Torah, a Chumash, a Bible, take it out, join us. And you can read along, and of course I'll be adding commentaries. Genesis chapter 19 is a complex chapter. All the chapters are complex, but this one is really complex because it has in it the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the escape of Lot, and then Lot commits incest with his two daughters and has children from them. So it's actually a place in the Torah. You can see early on, chapter 19, we're still in the book of Genesis, and the Torah is going to discuss and present us with cases, not of one case of incest, two cases of incest, because Lot lands up sleeping with two of his daughters, and they both have children. But before we get to that, we'll have to read the chapter and discuss a few other things in order. And one of these things is the destruction of Sodom. A very controversial topic comes out of it, the subject of sodomy, derived from the name Sodom, because the men of Sodom were corrupt, and they exhibited this corruptness when they wanted to rape these two men, these two angels that came to save Lot and to extricate him from Sodom. So the men were threatened with rape by the townspeople, and hence the expression sodomy. This is very controversial in our modern age because we live in an age when people who are homosexual or gay are accepted. But we'll see in the Torah, in the Bible, there's no question about it. If you study the Bible, you look into the Torah, and this is the way classical, definitely Orthodox Judaism views it, that sodomy, homosexuality, is a terrible sin because it's not a natural way of having sex. So that's one of the things also that we learn from this chapter, going to be coming up. And of course, then you have the destruction of Sodom. Some people like to say, well, it's not true. How do you know? There is an area by the Dead Sea in the southern portion that is actually lower than the rest of the Dead Sea. I don't know if you know, but the Dead Sea is the lowest point on physical Earth. The highest point is Mount Everest, they say, and the lowest point physically, if you go down in the topography, the lowest point is the Dead Sea. So, and the Dead Sea itself goes very deep. But there is a shallow part to the Dead Sea, which is to the south, which supposedly is the area where Sodom, and there were these 5 cities, and this is in the plain of Jericho, were destroyed. So it's not that far-fetched. For people who now are watching news, there is a volcanic eruption because I'm saying we don't know exactly. It says that fire and brimstone rained from heaven. Did it come from a volcano? Did it come from heaven itself? Was it a miracle? Was it something natural? Was it a combination of the natural and the miraculous? Either way, Sodom was destroyed in a hail of fire, and then it was flooded. And we see a similar thing happened in the city of Pompeii in Rome, where suddenly within minutes, really, the lava and the explosion from the volcano, Mount Vesuvius, moved so quickly, and it buried the city alive, where to this day they're still digging up bodies that were frozen in the lava, frozen by the heat. I mean, they were vacuum packed and sealed in the heat, with pets and men and women and children. They're still digging up parts of the city of Pompeii in Rome that was destroyed about 2,000 years ago by such an explosion. So just go back, another 1,000 or so, another 1,500 years before then, and this is what happened to the city of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities over there. And then finally, one of the other things I'd like to mention is we see in this chapter the discussion of angels. People have a question of whether angels exist. What are angels? Angels are divine beings that work for God. They're emissaries for God. They do God's bidding. Unlike human beings, they do not have free choice. But we'll see in this chapter the actions of angels, and they're mentioned as angels, malachim. In Hebrew, an angel is a malach, not melach. Melach is salt. Salt and angels do make an appearance in this week's in this chapter, but angels are called malachim. They do the bidding of the melech, of God, the king, and they are mentioned in this chapter. So we have destruction of Sodom, the sodomy, the topic of that, the topic of incest that comes up, and the destruction of Sodom, and belief in angels that we see represented in this chapter. Now, as I do, it's a long chapter. I like to read from the Aryeh Kaplan Living Torah. See, Aryeh Kaplan, the Living Torah. You can see it over there. I like to read the chapter in English. And if you have a Bible or a Torah or a Chumash, it's Genesis chapter 19, Breshit, Perek Yud Tet. That's 19 in Hebrew. And it has a lot of verses, 38 verses. So that is a long chapter, 38 verses in the chapter. So bear with me as we read through the chapter. It's actually very dramatic. It's a very, for the Torah, which is mostly a book of laws, this is unusual because this is like real powerful storytelling. So now it says like this. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, while Lot was sitting at the city gate. Lot saw them and got up to greet them, bowing his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to my house. Spend the night, bathe your feet, and then continue on your way early in the morning." "No," they replied, "we will spend the night in the square." Lot kept urging them until they finally turned aside to him and came to his house. He made a feast for them and baked matzah, and they ate. They had not yet gone to bed when the townspeople, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, young and old, all the people from every quarter. They called out to Lot and said, "Where are the strangers who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out to them in front of the entrance, shutting the door behind him. He said, "My brothers, don't do such an evil thing. I have two daughters who have never known a man. I will bring them out to you. Do as you please with them, but don't do anything to these men. After all, they have come under my roof." "Get out of the way," they shouted. They were saying, "This one man came here as an immigrant, and now all of a sudden he has set himself up as a judge? We'll give it to you worse than to them." They pushed against Lot very much and tried to break down the door. The strangers inside reached out and pulled Lot to them into the house, closing the door. They struck the men who were standing at the entrance with blindness, young and old alike, and the Sodomites tried in vain to find the door. The strangers said to Lot, "Who do you have here? A son-in-law, your own sons, your daughters? If you have anyone in the city, get them out of the area. We are about to destroy this place, for the people's outcry is great before God. God sent us to destroy it. Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were betrothed to his daughters. He said, "Get moving, get out of this area. God is about to destroy the city." To his sons-in-law, it was all a big joke. As dawn was breaking, the two angels hurried Lot. "Get moving," they said. "Take your wife and two daughters who are here. You don't want to be swept away because of the city's sin." He hesitated. The strangers grabbed him, his wife, and his two daughters by the hand, leading them out and left them on the outskirts of the city. God had shown pity on Lot. When the angel had led them out, he said, "Run for your life. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the valley. Flee to the hills so that you not be swept away." Lot said to them, "Oh God, no. I have found favor in your eyes, and you have been very kind in saving my life. But I cannot reach the hills to escape. The evil will overtake me and I will die. Please, there is a city here close enough for refuge. It is insignificant. I will flee there. Isn't it insignificant? And I will survive." The angel replied to him, "I will also give you special consideration to this matter. In this matter, I will not overturn the city you mentioned. But hurry, run there. I can do nothing until you get there." The city was henceforth known as Zoar, which means insignificant. The sun had risen by the time that Lot arrived in Zoar. God made sulfur and fire rain down on Sodom and Gomorrah. It came from God out of the sky. He overturned these cities along with the entire plain, destroying everyone who lived in the cities and all that was growing from the ground. Lot's wife looked behind him, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. Abraham woke up early in the morning, hurrying back to the place where he had stood before God. He stared at Sodom and Gomorrah and the whole area of the plain, and all he saw was heavy smoke rising from the earth like the smoke of a lime kiln. When God had destroyed the cities of the plain, God had remembered Abraham. Thus, when he overturned the cities in which Lot lived, he allowed Lot to escape the upheaval. Lot went up from Zoar and settled in the hills together with his two daughters, since he was afraid to remain in Zoar. He lived in a cave alone with his two daughters. The older girl said to the younger, "Our father is growing old, and there is no other man left in the world to marry us in a normal manner. Come, let's get our father drunk with wine and sleep with him. We will then survive through children from our father." That night, they got their father drunk with wine, and the older girl went and slept with her father. He was not aware that she had lain down or gotten up. The next day, the older girl said to the younger, "Last night it was I who slept with my father. Tonight, let's get him drunk with wine again. You go sleep with him, and we will survive through children from our father." That night, they again made their father drunk with wine. The younger girl got up and she slept with him. He was not aware that she had lain down or gotten up. Lot's two daughters became pregnant from their father. The older girl had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the ancestor of the nation Moab that exists today. The younger girl also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the ancestor of the people of Ammon, who exists today. And that's the end of the chapter. Wow, it's really got a lot of action there. And as I usually do, we look at the Rashi first. But what I want to do now is, since we ended off on this topic of the incest of Lot and his daughters, let's take a look at a commentary from the English translation of the Zohar. Don't panic. It's a beautiful commentary, and I think it speaks to us as adults, as mature adults. It explains a lot of things that are puzzling. Firstly, about the ways of God. Why does God let such a thing happen? Right? I mean, that's a question. After all, God is leading the world. It's God's world, and he arranges events. So why would he let such events unfold, right? It's an immoral thing. Well, first of all, this is before the time of the giving of the Torah. When the Torah was given, the laws of sexual morality were laid down, and incest became forbidden. But before the Torah was given, the lines were not so clear. And this type of incest was technically allowed. It might not have been encouraged or desired, but it was not technically forbidden as such at that time. But let's take a look here. It says here as follows, discussing this subject. The Holy One, blessed be He, constantly turns the wheel of events, bringing hidden things to the top and then giving another turn and shaping things differently. He is ever scheming and planning how to effect the change and make a new pattern, all in accordance to the work. That is, the variation takes place in accordance to the works and deeds of man. He's discussing a certain verse here from Job that said, and they are turned round about by his devices according to their work. Pardon the noise outside, there's a lawnman outside. This means that the Holy One, blessed be He, constantly turns the wheel of events, bringing hidden things to the top, and then again giving another turn and shaping things differently. And thus by his devices, he is ever scheming and planning how to effect the change and make a new pattern. So God, in other words, God is running the world not in a static fashion. God is always thinking of how to stir events. It's a dynamic world. God is involved in dynamic action constantly in running the world. And all is according to the work. And this is based on the variation takes place in accordance with the works and deeds of man. The verse continues, according as he commands them upon the face of the habitable world. That is, it is in accordance with man's works that God shapes the course of events. In other words, our actions will determine the way God acts in all that he ordains on the face of the earth. Rabbi Elazar interpreted the words, and they are turned around about by his devices in the following manner. The Holy One guides the course of events so as to bring to pass a seemingly stable state of things. Sorry, just waiting for that sound to pass. The Holy One guides the course of events so as to bring to pass a seemingly stable state of things. But when the sons of man imagine that all before them is fixed and firmly established, when you think everything is, that's it, you get used to, you settle into a pattern of living. I mean, definitely when you look at Jewish history, it's so. When Jews settle into a country and or a place and they start living there comfortably for sometimes a couple of 100 years, all of a sudden things happen and the apple cart is overturned and they find themselves in an unsettled situation. That's because the Holy One turns his works into something altogether different from their former state. Compare God to a potter, the Zohar says, doing pottery, who in turning his wheel constantly fashions new vessels according to his fancy. So is the Holy One constantly reshaping his works, the instruments which constitute his potter's wheels, so to speak, being the lower world, being judged by the judgment court. So the lower world, that's our world, constantly being reshaped. And all is done in accordance with man's works. If they are good, The wheel revolves to the right, making the course of events highly favorable to them. And however long the wheel revolves, punishment never settles on that side. Should men, however, turn to evil ways, the Holy One imparts to his device a spin to the left, and all things now make a direction to the left, and the wheel gives to events a course unfavorable to the sons of man. Maybe that's an explanation for the difference between right and left. I don't know. So it goes on until they become penitent and retrace their evil ways. But the motive power of the wheel is centered in the works of man, there being no permanency. In this case, too, God manipulated events so as to attain a certain end, and all that happened had its roots in the supernal sphere. Now, listen to this. God had brought Abraham near to him, and there issued from him Ishmael. We know that. God brought Abraham near to him, and from Abraham came Ishmael. Ishmael was born before Abraham was circumcised. That is, before he was made perfect through the sign of the Holy Covenant. Then the Holy One, blessed be he, so devised that Abraham circumcised himself and entered the covenant and acquired his complete name of Abraham. That was went from Abram to Abraham, and was crowned by the supernal hay. That's the Abram got a hay, an H sound in his name. As soon as the symbolism was completed and Abraham was circumcised, there issued from him Isaac, Yitzchak, who was the holy seed and who was attached to the supernal spheres as symbolizing fire from water. Okay, we're not going to get into that because that's too complicated. From Lot again, now we get into the subject. From Lot again, and from his daughters, there came forth two disparate nations. Two separate nations came out of Lot and his daughters, who became attached to the side appropriate to them. We see here again how the Almighty contrives the course of things, turning about so that everything should fit into the general scheme and fall into its proper place. For observe that it would have been more fitting for Lot that the Holy One should have produced those two nations from his union with his wife. Like, why didn't God manipulate events so that Lot could have these two sons from his wife? Why did it have to come from his daughters? So the Zohar is saying, this is all God's plan. God wanted it this way, and we're still not at the punchline. It was, however, necessary that these nations should be attached to their predestined place, and for this, wine had to play its part. There was wine in the cave, if you remember from the reading, and they gave their father wine, and he became drunk. And wine indeed was found ready at hand in that cavern. The mystical part played by wine here is similar to that regarding which we read, and he drank of the wine that was drunken, as he already has already been explained elsewhere. That's in the time of Noah. Noah drank wine, and we saw as an explanation from the Zohar that he was trying to get into a highly spiritual place where he could understand what it was that Adam and Eve ate from and sinned. So it's getting into like really high mystical zones of trying to comprehend the unknown, reaching for a higher level. It's like when people go on drugs, when people drink alcohol, they enter into an altered mind state. Now, sometimes they do it unthinkingly, but if you do it in a more of a deliberate fashion, there is a going into a higher state. Like, for example, prophets, when they entered into prophecy, they literally became sort of like crazy. They entered into a higher altered mental consciousness, and their bodies collapsed. Their bodies would tremble. It's as if they were getting seizures. So when you go into these higher mental states, and the word mental can be used in different ways here, you enter into a higher consciousness. So something higher was happening here. Now, So they had two babies, and one of them was called Moab, and one of them was called Ammon. So Rabbi Yossi made the following comment, that the first daughter was bold-faced enough to call her son Moab, meaning Me'av, from the father. Whereas the younger one also had a son, and she called him Ben Ami, from my nation, or from me. So the mother, out of delicacy, gave that name, which being interpreted simply means the son of my people, without betraying who his father was. In other words, the oldest daughter was less ashamed, and she named her son from my father, whereas the second daughter named her son from my nation, or from me. So she covered up to some extent that this child was born from her father, an incestuous union. And there's a discussion there's a discussion whether Lot was aware of what was happening. So some say, if you look at the verse, it says he got drunk. He was not aware when he got drunk, but when he got up, he did have an awareness of what happened. So at the end of the act, he was more aware of what happened. And all of this, the purpose of all of this was to bring about the birth of the Messiah. Now imagine that. The topic of Mashiach, of the Messiah, comes because from Moab is going to come Ruth, the Moabitess, and Ruth becomes the ancestress of King David, who is the Mashiach, the king, and is the ancestor of the Mashiach. We call the Mashiach ben David, Messiah, son of David. So this is a weird thing. I mean, if you think about it, a weird way to bring the Messiah. Why do it in such a way? One of the explanations I've heard is that it was all to trick the Satan, because the forces of evil, had it been done in a normal, natural way, then the forces of evil under the direction of the Satan would have found a way to stymie and to mess up the plans. So God had to do things in this contrived way through destruction of Sodom and Lot being saved, and Lot and his daughters landing up in a cave, and then they're having sex with Lot, their father, and then having babies. And then from that comes the Messiah of all things. So this whole whirlwind of events, this whole whirlwind of the chapter really is, you could say, Chevle Mashiach, birth pangs of Messiah. Like, surprise, surprise. This is the way the Messiah originated, from this point. Here it says, contrary-wise, the similar word in reference to the younger one is written defectively. Okay, no, I'm not skipping that. The underlying meaning is is that he was unaware. He was unaware, meaning Lot was unaware that the Holy One intended to raise from her King David and Solomon, all the other kings, and finally the Messiah. So that's what this piece in the Zohar brings out, that it's all meant to bring about the ancestry of the Messiah. Very strange ancestry, if you think about it. The royal house, this is the beginnings of the Jewish royal house. The royal house of Israel comes about from, literally from the seed, conceived from Lot, and especially his the older daughter Moab, and the younger daughter also. There's a descendant called Nama. She becomes a convert. She's a princess and marries a princess of Ammon, and she marries King Solomon, and they have a son Rehoboam, who becomes one of the kings of Israel. Now, as I usually do, we look at the Rashi. Let's look at the Rashi commentary on chapter 19. select Rashis. We're not going to do all the Rashi. We will just look at some of them and see what we can draw out with extra material to teach us about this chapter. So now it says in verse 1, now we're back to verse 1, chapter 19. Chapter 19, verse 1. It says, Vayavo'u shnei hamalachim Sodoma ba'erev. And they came, two angels came to Sodom in the evening. So what's the significance of two? Previously, we had three angels that came to Abraham, right? So now we're down to two. So what is the number two significant? What is the significance of the number two? So Rashi says, Echad lahashchit et Sodom. One came on a mission to destroy Sodom, because angels are only capable of doing one mission at a time. They do their mission and they return to God to receive another mission. They sometimes they disappear after doing one mission. Depends. There's different kinds of angels, but they two angels, one to destroy Sodom and one to save Lot. So that's the significance of two. One's job was to destroy the city of Sodom, and the other was to save Lot. And the one who saved Lot was also the one who had cured Abraham. Now, I saw something in the Medrash says, no, we're not there yet. Sorry. To cure Abraham, and then there was a third angel who came to announce the birth of Isaac, to tell Sarah that she would be giving birth to a baby boy of Isaac. And since that one had done his mission, Kivan Sha'asa Shlichuto, Rashi says, Nistaleklo, so he departed. Now, question. It says they are called Malachim, right? They're called angels. But later, they're also called Anashim. So one explanation is that in the tent of Abraham, where angels were common guests. I mean, we're going here with the assumption that Abraham was a holy man and that he would be visited by angels all the time. Okay, that's the assumption. And because of that, he was more familiar with them, and therefore they were called Anashim in the case of Abraham, in reference to Abraham. But in reference to Lot, they're called angels because he never had the privilege of angels coming to visit him that often. There was a rarity. So therefore, now that they're visiting Lot, they are specifically called angels. It's just a question, why in some places are they called people, and why in some places are they called angels? So that's one explanation over here in the Rashi. Now, it says, Velot Yoshev Beshar Sodom. Velot Yoshev. Again, let's take a look. Velot Yoshev Beshar Sodom. Lot sat. Beshar Sodom. Yoshev, it is written defectively as if implying he sat. What? So what's he sitting? What's significant? Why would the Torah want to tell us that Lot is sitting at the gate of Sodom, right? Because Oto Hayom Minuhu Shafet Aleim, because the Medrash says on that day the people of Sodom appointed Lot to be a judge over them. And I saw something interesting in the oh yes, I know where I saw it. In the Medrash Rabbah, Medrash Rabbi says, yeah, actually it's sort of funny. And Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, right? So he sat, it's written defectively. The Hebrew implies, intimating that only that day had he been appointed by them chief justice, right? So he was an important man. And the Medrash says there were 5 principal judges in Sodom. False principles. It's not. It's like in English literature, there's a play called Every Man, and you have characteristics that are embodied as characters, greed, hope, and so on. So here's a characteristic that's embodied as a judge. So there was Mr. Judge called false principles. Then there was another judge called lying speech, a guy who's a liar. A cad. Cad is an old-fashioned English word for a guy who's like a no-goodnik, a bum. And then the other one was justice perverter. That's very funny if you think about it, justice perverter. And the other judge was man flayer, a person who shreds people. So these were the 5 principal judges in Sodom, of which Lot was the chief justice, while Lot was the chief judge. When he told them something which pleased them, they would say to him, go further, take a higher seat. But if he said something which displeased them, they would say, this one fellow came into sojourn, and he still needs to play the judge. Right? We see that they criticized him later. So they were a rotten, no good bunch of people. That's the bottom line. So on that day, Lot, you can imagine, maybe he was feeling very proud of himself. He became the chief justice of this nation, of the city-state, of this group of nations. And all of a sudden, he sees these angels, and he bows to them out of a sign of respect, because he learned how to honor guests in the tent of Abraham, in the home of Abraham. And he says to them, please come in a roundabout way. He says, suruna, please turn aside. In other words, what does he say? Bow. Tavo, he says, suru, go around, because going a roundabout way, I don't want people to notice, because it was forbidden to have guests in Sodom. No guests allowed. It's like in the Third Reich, no Jews and dogs allowed, right? So no guests allowed in Sodom. So he invites them home. I'm just going to skip over here. Right. So they asked him, what kind of people are in this town? He says, wicked people. And then they ask him, so who else do you have here? Pshuto shel mikra, mi yesh lecha od ba'ir hazot, chutz me'ishtecha uvnotecha shebabayit. Who else do you have here in this town besides your own family? Right? They're asking him. So, vayamru hanashim elot od mi lecha po chatan uvanecha uvnotecha. Chatan uvanecha uvnotecha. Chatan means son-in-law. So what's this thing with son-in-law? V'im yesh lecha chatan o banim ubanot hotzim min hamakom. Uvanecha, shnei, and your sons. So what sons? He doesn't have sons. Chatan uvanecha b'natecha. So this is referring to his sons-in-law, because it says b'nei b'natecha nesuot. He had 4 daughters, as a matter of fact. He had 2 married daughters and 2 engaged daughters. and you've got to get out of town. And because it says Chatanav, he had two engaged daughters. So escape, and they flee, and on the way out, Lot's wife looks backwards and she becomes a pillar of salt. Why does she become a pillar of salt? Because originally she was the one that went and spilled the beans when Lot had asked her, please serve a meal to the guests with salt. She says, oh, now you want salt. Well, we don't have salt in the house. So she went out and she started asking the neighbors for salt because they had guests. So she was the one that gave away the secret that Lot was harboring guests. And it was about salt that she went outside. So mida keneged mida. Remember, there's this principle, measure for measure, that God punishes exactly according to what a person did wrong. So she sinned, so to speak, through the subject of salt. So she in turn became a pillar of salt. And on this, I have a commentary. It's called, this is a brand new commentary. It's called Chumash with Teachings of the Talmud, put up by Art Scroll. Very, very nice. It collects the teachings of the Talmud on every chapter of the Torah. And there is something over here from Tractate Barachot, from the Talmud Brachot, which I want to share with you. It says here, I'll read it in English. It's got an English translation. When someone sees a place where certain miracles occurred, he is supposed to recite a baracha that praises Hashem. When you come to a place, this is a well-known thing, where a miracle occurred, either for you or for the Jewish people, you are supposed to pronounce a blessing. Don't forget, we're now reading from Tractate Brachas, the tractate about blessings. In the case of a person who sees the pillar of salt that was once Lot's wife, one must recite 2 brachas. So apparently there's a place where one could, this goes back to the times of the Talmud, they could still see a place where, I remember when I was in Israel on a tour of the Ein Gedi area near the Dead Sea, and they said, oh, that pillar over there of salt, that's supposed to be Lot's wife. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know how anybody can know today. But in the times of the Talmud, they still knew from going back to biblical times. And they said, the sages of the Talmud said, that you're supposed to make 2 blessings when you see the pillar of salt. For the punishment of Lot's wife, we recite the bracha for misfortune, right? We recite the bracha for misfortune. This is like when a person dies, for example. So the bracha is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Dayan ha'emet, the judge of truth. So it's misfortune. She died over there. She went from being a living being, a living human being, to turning into a pillar of salt. So it's a tragedy, and it was a punishment. So the sages say we make a blessing, Baruch Dayan ha'emes, for seeing or hearing bad news, like a death of a person. For Lot, who was rescued because of the merit of Abraham, we make the blessing Baruch Zacher et Hatzadikim. But Lot was rescued over there while his wife died. Lot himself was rescued. So the blessing is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Zacher et Hatzadikim. I guess I bet you've never heard of this blessing before. There is a blessing that runs like this: Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Zacher et Hatzadikim, who remembers the righteous. Who remembers the righteous. So that's what the Talmud says when you come across the pillar of salt, where Lot's wife, when she's still standing there, you make two blessings, one Dayan Ha'emes and the other Zocher HaTzadikim. Interesting. Now, Lot is in all this trouble, so then there's a verse 29. We're moving on. Chapter 19, verse 29, it says, Vayiskar Elohim et Avram. Lord, Hashem, God, remembered Abraham. So what did he remember? Mahus Chirata Shel Avram a Lot. What does remembering Abraham concerning Lot have to do with anything? Niskar Shahayalot Yodea Shesara Ishta Shel Avram Veshama Sha'amar Avram B'Mitzrayim Al Sara Achaisihi Velo Gila Hadavar. Now Mida Keneged Mida, a measure for measure. Abraham remembered that Lot kept quiet when Pharaoh questioned Abraham about the status of Sarah, and he said that he didn't say she's his wife. Lot knew that Sarah was his wife, but he didn't say anything, so that didn't get Abraham into trouble with Paro. So for that, in that merit, Abraham remembered him, and meaning God remembered Abraham in the merit of Abraham. Shayachas alav that Lot had mercy on Abraham. So therefore, God had mercy on Lot as well. So again, you see Mida Keneged Mida, measure for measure. Lot had mercy on Abraham. He didn't divulge Abraham's secret that Sarah really was his wife to Pharaoh. So now God has mercy on Lot and he saves him. And moving along, we're going to come to this subject, a verse, chapter 19, verse 33, Vatishkena, and it says they gave him wine. Let's take a look. Vatishkena et avihen yain, and they made their father drink wine. Balayla hu, at night. Vatavah habchira vatishkav el aviha velo yada beshachva uvekuma. Vatishkena. She gave, so where does this wine come from? So there's different interpretations. One is that the people of Sodom produced so much wine. I mean, they were drinkers. They stored them in caves. So that's one explanation that I saw from one of the commentaries. And then there's another explanation that this was a wine that God himself had prepared over there. It was a special wine. Remember, he had to have the special high. Yayin is damin lehem b'ma'ara. They found wine in the cave, and listen to what Rashi says: Lahotzi mehen shtei umat, in order to bring forth two nations. It was like an anesthetic. They couldn't have done it consciously. Their high moral code wouldn't have allowed them to have sexual relations between each other, the father and daughters. So wine was there, but they had to. God had a purpose. God needed to bring forth these two nations of Moab and Ammon. Remember, we saw in the Zohar stirring these events. So wine was there prepared, in whichever way you want to say. Either it was prepared by the people of Sodom, they originally kept wine there, or for storage purposes, or God himself somehow had brought that wine to be over there. But it was necessary, Rashi says, to bring forth two nations, Moab and Ammon. Vatishkav es avihen. And it says Vatishkav es aviha, and she lay with her father. But Seir Aksiv Vatishkav imay. So by the older daughter it says she lay with her father, and with the younger daughter it says and she lay with him. So father is more of a concrete description of Lot than him. Him is him. Who's the him? It could be, you're talking roundabout, right? So lefi shelo patcha beznut. So this is because she did not start this sexual immorality. The younger one was led into it by the older one. Ela achota limadeta, but her older sister taught her. Chisech aleha akatev velo peresh genusa. So the Torah covers up for her and doesn't elaborate her disgusting act. Genus means like a disgusting act. So it's like him. Aval bechira, but the older one, shepascha biznus, pirsama hakasa b'mefarish. But the older one, who was more brazen and started this immoral act. So look at this dichotomy. On the one hand, we're saying God has a plan here. On the other hand, it's not nice what they did. It's obviously not nice. The Torah and the commentators are not pleased with this act. It's not as if this is the way to do things. You want to do great things, go commit adultery and incest and all the other sins. No, that's not what it is. The Torah definitely has a straight attitude to that. But events being manipulated by God in unexpected ways, as we saw from that opening quote in the Zohar, then these things came to be. So the older one, because she was more brazen, the Torah describes her act as having slept with her father. But the younger one, being not as brazen, she was led on by her older sister. So the Torah then speaks with a little bit more gently about her, that she slept with him, not saying specifically the father. Okay. Now there's a question here, chapter 19, verse 36. It says, "Vataharena shtei benot Lot me'avihen," and the herayon means pregnancy, and they both became pregnant, both daughters, from their father. So there's a discussion in the commentaries. Usually women do not become pregnant. Usually women do not become pregnant from the first time sexual intercourse. And that's what Rashi says. How could they become pregnant? Because it's not normal for the first intercourse to lead to pregnancy. Because usually there's a problem in the case of virgins with their hymens, and we'll see, Rashi talks about it. Afal pi she'ein ha'isha mit'aberet mibia rishona. Even though, normally speaking, a woman does not become pregnant from her first act of sexual intercourse, eila shaltu ba'atzman. These two had control over themselves. Because as we saw in the reading of the chapter, they thought the whole world had died out and they were the last survivors on earth, right? And I'm reading from the English translation, and they took out their shame. In parentheses, it says hymen, outside. Somehow they physically manipulated themselves so that their hymen would break, I guess, and their father could impregnate them as if there was no hymen to interrupt the procedure. Then Isabru mibia rishona, and they became pregnant from the first. Bia is a polite way, it's come from the word ba, to come, from the first sexual intercourse with their father. And so the first one called her son Moab. This one who was not modest, Persha Shemaviahu. So she declared that he's from my father. She was more brazen. Aval Seira, the younger one, Krata Bilishan Nakia. She was called her son in a more refined language, in a cleaner language, the Kibla Schar Bimei Moshe. And so she received a reward that in the times of Moshe, God says, don't kill out the Moabites, but you can harass them. They were the Jews, the children of Israel were allowed to harass the Moabite nation, burn their fields, do whatever was necessary to cut through their territory to get to the land of Israel. But with Ammon, the children of Israel in the time of Moses were instructed to not do them any harm. Leave them be. Let them alone. So that's the Rashi. Let's take a look now. I want to see a couple of things here. This is Tzena Orena. This was a book that was used by Jewish women for hundreds of years, and it contains teachings from the Medrash and other commentators. Okay, again, in the case of Lot's daughters, you see the commentators. Now, this was a book, Tzena Orena. If you look it up, it was written in the Middle Ages in Yiddish Hebrew, for women to read at home, to give them like a summary of the main teachings of the Chumash. And you see this subject, I mean, it was not hidden from the women. It's not as if they soft pedaled it and they wanted to, what's the word, sanitize or edit or in some way cut out, censor the subject matter. No. Let's take a look. Lot's daughters, it says, Vatamer habechira el hatzeira. The older daughter said to the younger daughter, Lot had 2 unmarried daughters. The older said to the younger, our father is old and may die suddenly, or will become unable to father children. There is no man left to make us pregnant. They thought that the entire world had been destroyed, as in the days of the flood. Rabbi Bechaya, that's a commentator from the Middle Ages, writes that the daughters were modest and were ashamed to ask their father to have relations with him. And in fact, the commentators go out of the way to stress that their motives were pure. Lot's motives were not pure. He had secretly been desirous of his daughters. And in fact, they say, when he said to the strangers when they were trying to bang down his door, take my daughters instead of the men, that's because he had, what is it? How does it go? He had desired says Hashem said, usually a man, this is from the Medrash, Hashem said, usually a man hands himself over to be killed for the sake of his wife and daughters. Lot instead was ready to hand out his daughters to be abused. So God said, I swear you keep them for yourself. Ultimately, all future generations will sneer at you as they read in the Torah, and the 2 daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father, because Lot had secretly wanted his daughters for himself. It's the implication there that he had a secret desire for them, so that's why he came to be viewed, or he's viewed as not having the right attitude. But the 2 daughters, they wanted to save humanity, so they meant well. Rabbi Bechaya writes that the daughters were modest, excuse me, and were ashamed to ask their father to have relations with them, which would have been permitted to the descendants of Noah. So this is what I mentioned. At that time, it was not strictly forbidden. This is before the giving of the Torah. God placed wine in the cave in which they had hidden themselves. They gave him this wine until he was too drunk to know that he had relations with them. Our sages say that Lot did not know when they slept together the first night, but when he awoke, he realized what had happened. Even so, the next night he got drunk once again. And then it says, Vatirana, they became pregnant. The elder one had a son whom she named Moab, which means from a father, Me'av. And Av is a father, because she was immodest. God later gave Moshe permission to disturb the nation of Moab, though he could not declare war on them. The younger was modest and called his son Ben Ami, son of my nation, and did not clearly state his origin. Therefore, God forbade Moshe from doing any harm at all to his descendants, the nation of Ammon. So now we saw that. We can take another quick look at the teachings of the Talmud and the Chumash, touch on something else. Interesting concept here that Lot wanted to flee to a city called Tzoar. Why Tzoar? Because it was the newest. There were 5 cities over there. Sodom and Gomorrah were older cities. Tzoar was a younger city. So the Talmud in the Tractate Shabbat, extracts a person should try to live in a new city, since fewer sins have been committed there than in an older city. Wow, that's interesting. The Talmud actually advises a person should try to move to newer cities and not stick around and stay in older cities, because older cities, just by virtue of the fact that fallible human beings have lived there, more sins have been committed there. And this is learned from Lot's describing the city of Tzoar, to which he wanted to escape, as near and small. Lot didn't have to tell the angel that Tzoar was close by. The angels helping him escape could see that for themselves. Lot meant the city was near in time to when it was first settled, and by small he meant that its transgressions are few. We see that this is what he meant from what he said next. I shall now flee there. He was obviously escaping there now. So why does the Torah include this word? The Hebrew word Lot used for now, na, which was a gematria of 51. We know that Sodom at that time had been settled for 52 years, and Tzoar for 51. So it was 1 year younger, 1 year less old than Sodom. So therefore it was a safer place. And let's see if I can extract one more teaching. Yes, rewarded for refined speech. This is from 3 tractates, Bava Kama, Nazir, and Horias. Hashem rewards every good deed, even, this is talking about Vatikra Shma Moab, Vatikra Shma Ben Ami, the way they named their sons, that the older daughter was more brazen and named her son Moab, whereas the younger daughter was more modest and named her son Ben Ami. So the subject matter here of this little section is reward for refined speech. Hashem rewards every good deed, even a person's use of refined speech. So when you speak politely, when you speak in a more refined manner, we learn from this, from the younger daughter of Lot, that you will be rewarded for that. In this story, the elder daughter called her son Moab, which means from father, when discussing her descendant. The pasuk says, do not oppress Moab and do not incite war against them. This means only that Bnei Yisrael may not fight them in a war, but they may force Moab to supply them with bread and water. It's what I said. They allow to put pressure on Moab. The younger daughter was more refined and called her son Ben Ami, meaning the son of my people. Her name does not give mention of the sin from which her son was born. When discussing her descendants, the pasuk says, do not oppress them and do not incite them. The pasuk does not mention anything about battle. This teaches that Bnei Yisrael may not do anything at all to harm the nation of Ammon. So Because she was more refined in speech, her descendants, the nation that would be descended from her, was subsequently saved. I hope you derived some benefit from our teaching and reviewing and reading and learning Genesis chapter 19 with some of the commentaries, as much as I enjoyed being here with you. And I hope to continue the series as regularly as I can. Stay tuned. My email is rudomin@att.net or rudomin@jpi.org. Thank you so much.